Hey guys, I'm Amira and welcome to Open Up. This is your communication podcast and I am your host, also known as the communication expert. I'm your podcast host, your life coach, and also a speaker. Each and every single week, I'm going to be bringing you conversations to help you level up the way that you communicate, whether that's with yourself or in your relationships. Through each conversation, you're going to leave with food for thought, skills that you didn't know you needed, and ways to develop your relationships. So join me here as you learn the lessons that you didn't get to learn at school. Pull up a seat and join us as we open up. Welcome back for another episode on the Open Up podcast. So I always get a little bit nervous, a little bit apprehensive before we hit record. And I've been out of the studio for a few weeks. So I feel like a beginner all over again. Now, when this episode goes live, if you are listening to this in real time, it is what I call the month of love. It's February. And if you're not listening to this in real time, it honestly, truly does not matter. Now, the fact you've clicked the title and want to listen to this episode speaks volumes, first of all. The second thing is, regardless of what your gender is, of what your relationship status is, this is going to be something that I want to delve into and make super practical. Now, when I say self-love, what comes to your mind? And I can imagine most of you recoiling, cringing, thinking, oh, eye roll, whatever. And sometimes I think, especially in the coaching world, that there are terms or phrases that we just kind of reel out way too often, especially with our amazing Instagram quotes. Don't get me wrong, I love a good quote, love an inspirational, motivational thing that gets us going. But sometimes we don't know how to put something into practice. And as it's February, as it is like this month of love and so much is focused on, are you dating somebody? What are you doing for Valentine's Day? Or maybe you've got the pressure of being in a long-term relationship and you're like, we don't even celebrate that anymore. I actually want to zoom out and think about love in a completely different way and think about the way that you nourish your relationship with yourself. And I think that is often one that we forget or we neglect or we think isn't that important, especially, I like to think I've got super kind, thoughtful people in my community. So if you're constantly thinking about other people or your friendships or your family or your romantic relationships, and sometimes you're giving so much to other people that you don't actually know how to give to yourself. So in very true Amira style, we're going to make today very practical. I'm going to go through steps that I think are going to truly help you. And even if you only took away one step and said, right, I'm going to focus on that, then I think that would be so helpful. So think about, as you go through this episode, where are you doing it really well? Are there moments where actually you do appreciate yourself? And where are your blind spots? Where do you struggle to really adopt that concept? So before we get into any of that, let's set the scene. Like, what do we mean when we say self-love? Because I think that's quite an important piece, first of all, especially if you're listening or you are watching and you are cringing. So self-love, if I had to sum it up into 3 parts, is how you look after yourself. How do you care for yourself? How do you authentically show up in the world? And the clarity that you have around what you're willing to accept and what you're not. Now, going back to what I said earlier in terms of cringing when I said self-love or rolling your eyes at it, a couple of months ago, I was running a workshop as part of the She Oath community, which was incredible, amazing. And I was talking to one person and we were kind of delving into what their situation was, where they wanted some support, where they were feeling stuck and how it was impacting their life. And I think that without us defining and getting super clear on what self-love is and what it means, we don't realize the impact that it has on our day-to-day. We don't realize the impact that it has on our relationships. We don't realize the impact that it has where we feel like we're lacking confidence or we're beating ourselves up because we've made a mistake and we've got little compassion for that. So I think the important part is to understand, what does it mean? And also, without self-love, without a healthy amount of self-love in your life, how is it impacting you? And often you'll find that you're settling in situations or relationships that perhaps you shouldn't be. You might be walking away from situations feeling super resentful because you're not speaking up for what you want or what you need or what's a priority in your life. So going back to when I was at the She Oath event, and I remember we were working through the situation, and the person turned around to me and said, "So what, Amira, you're telling me that I don't love myself?" And it was such an important I guess thing for me to hear, but for them to be able to voice as well, because I think sometimes it's a really difficult concept to get your head around. Like, on a conscious level, if I said to you right now, stop and pause and think about, do you love yourself? You are probably going to say to me, yeah, of course I do. Of course I love myself, Amira. It's quite difficult to think about if you don't love yourself unless you are very aware of your negative self-talk, if you're super aware of like how much you dislike yourself, if there's a loathing underneath that. So unless there's that and you're aware of it, you will probably say to me, of course I love myself. And going back to this particular person in the workshop, that's kind of the situation we were in. But let's look at how that manifested for them. Let's look at how the lack of self-love that they had for themselves was causing like discomfort, upset, and hurt. And they were essentially in a situationship. And their belief was that they needed to be there for this person. And regardless of, let's say, the breadcrumbs that this person was giving them, they truly, truly believed that they needed to show up for this person. Otherwise, that person wouldn't be able to kind of like live or survive or get through this difficult moment or this difficult period of their life without it. But what they were doing as part of it was sacrificing their own needs. The emotional and mental and probably even physical turmoil that it had on them was not beneficial to their life. It wasn't helpful. It was spilling over into their work. And they had an incredible job, led a team, and on an emotional level, wasn't serving them. And one piece of the puzzle, not saying this was the only thing, but one piece of the puzzle for that person was really around not loving or valuing themselves enough. And I think when we get practical, this is going to make so much more sense. So if you're wondering or questioning, first of all, how much do you love yourself? I'm going to give you a few reflection questions as we move through this episode so you can get very, very honest. Now, I had a conversation very recently with somebody that was quite confronting for me, and it was like my inner work and the things that I'm working on. And sometimes I forget, because I coach and because I work so deeply with my clients, being on the receiving end and what it feels like. So I do want to say that when I ask you these questions and I get you to sit and I get you to reflect, that it's not always easy, and I want you to give yourself that space and that compassion. And it's okay if it feels hard, if it feels difficult. Pause. Like, doesn't mean don't do the work, but pause. If it feels tough, like, come back to it at another point. So it's just my reminder that I'm sticking in there, because I had to remind myself this week, and because I coach and I coach so deeply, sometimes I forget that. So another area of self-love that I want to highlight and flag to you is that being able to show up authentically and really advocate for yourself as well, a huge part of self-love is being able to celebrate yourself. And I'm smiling because almost every single one of my clients, I have to actually think about them all, I think all of them have struggled or are struggling with this. And it's something that I think I work with all of them on in some way, shape, or form. And this kind of shows up in two ways, right? One, they find it extremely difficult to acknowledge their strengths and what they're good at, let alone play to their strengths. And what I mean by play to their strengths is, okay, I would say in my community, we all collectively quite naturally look at how we want to get better. We reflect, we try and be honest with ourselves, some of us more than others, but we're leaning on that side of the scale where we're reflecting when we're looking inwards. But sometimes what we actually need to do is recognize and understand, what are we good at and how do you hone that? How do you fine tune that? And how do you celebrate that? If you put as much energy as you did into reflecting and trying to shift the things you don't like about yourself and actually focus on the things that you are good at, the strengths, and play to them, that's exactly what I mean when I say play to them, you do yourself so much of a better service. So kind of taking that a step forward, and something that I get my clients to do, and I know that I speak about this on Instagram as well, is to celebrate their wins. And actually, before I walked into the studio this morning, I did very, very early morning live check-ins with all of my clients, and one of my clients messaged me back with their wins, and it just lit me up. And it's not why get them to do it, just to feed my ego. But it's to get them to strengthen that muscle in their brain and start to acknowledge and accept, wow, I am good. All right, I did do that well. And that doesn't mean that life is going well all the time. We don't need to sit into that space. We don't need to sugarcoat. But part of self-love is being able to have that acceptance. What am I good at? And this leads into a bigger narrative that I really want to talk about. And I'm going to give a couple of personal examples here. I wouldn't say as well, so if you are sitting here watching this or listening to this episode being like, or you turned it on and you were cringing and be like, what do I need to know about self-love? I don't think I went through my life being like, oh, I don't love myself. I don't think that was something I ever thought. But there were definitely signs of where it manifested. So going back to example I want to share is when I talk about my clients finding it really difficult to acknowledge their strengths, celebrate themselves, really celebrate the moments that they're proud of. This also goes back to a narrative on quite a societal level that is drummed into us from quite a young age. Now, this might differ depending on your culture, depending on your background, depending on where you've grown up. But it's that narrative of like, don't brag. Don't shout about yourself too much because you'll come across as arrogant. You might come across as rude. Now, there is a difference, by the way, between being rude and being arrogant versus being able to, what I like to say, speak up for yourself and advocate for yourself. There is a very, very big difference between that. And so because that's kind of been drummed into us, or we've held that narrative for such a long time, self-love is not something that we know how to lean into. And if you go back to what I said right at the beginning, I said self-love is the way that you care for yourself. It's the way that you show up. You're able to speak your truth. You're able to acknowledge yourself. You're able to accept those parts of you that you don't like. We're going to get onto that. So it's a really, really important piece because we don't do enough work around nourishing ourselves, around looking after ourselves. And when I say self-love is to some extent your self-care, the way you look after yourself, the way you nurture yourself. Okay, guys, it is more than a bubble bath. It's more than a face mask. Don't get me wrong, I love it. But it is about those small, small moments. What are you doing in your everyday? And that's why I said that this goes for every gender. And I work with a mix of genders. And I think sometimes people are surprised by that. And I know that with my male clients, I explore this with them as well. And some of them have got terrible negative dialogue and don't know how to value themselves. And there's a reason why that's shown up in their life. So I really do want to acknowledge why it can feel very self-indulgent to think about self-love. But I do want to say that if you do not learn how to cultivate this and nourish this within yourself, you are going to find this incredibly difficult to nourish your relationships outside of yourself. Whether that is with a partner, whether that's when you're dating, whether that's your family or your friendships. If you don't learn how to give that to yourself, it's going to be very difficult to show up in other ways in your relationship. You're going to lack confidence. You're probably going to lack self-esteem. You're probably going to stay in your comfort zone and not go for the opportunities that you really want to go for. So I am going to say it loud and clear that self-love is not selfish. You just might not have ever been taught how to do it. And all right, insert personal story. Let's go for it. We're going to get deep. I'm in a really deep mood this week. Sometimes, you know, as well, my word of the year is fun. I have to remember that. Like, it's fun and joy. Like, we need to find some lightness in this. I remember distinctly being 8 years old at school. I know. And I was labelled bossy from a really, really young age. Actually, my first ever teacher, she was gold. She was absolute gold. She was a badass. She was like, bear in mind I was 5, but anyway, really wicked teacher. She didn't label me bossy. She labeled me a leader, and I'm an airy, so I'm really going to channel that. But anyway, other than her, everyone else in school I think labeled me bossy, and it was really said to me in a really, really like unhelpful way. It was said it as though like it was a really bad quality that I had. And I'm sharing this because it's a really good example of where we take on those narratives, and it took me a long time to like lean into, I'm actually quite good at leading people. I'm actually quite good at being a coach and like leaning into my clients. And it's because of that. And there was one specific project I was working on. I was 8. It was the ancient Greeks. Anyway, got really excited about it. And I ended up, when you're like, I think I was like year 4, year 5, when you're that age, everything like gets turned into a competition. So I think there was a prize for first, second, third place. And being my typical energy, I was like, yeah, we're going for first prize, right? But that was also because I think the last project, I bummed it and like got slated for it by the teacher. So I thought, cool, I'm going to show you. So anyway, I did this Greek project. I'm not going to lie, it was so good. I think my mum must still have it. But anyway, it was a wicked project and I won. My teacher couldn't even give me the win. And she said, I think I've written it down actually, because it was actually a quote that like really is sat with me. I mean, I'm way older. I'm like more than 3 times how old I was and it still stayed with me. So I really want to like just illustrate the impact of these moments and why we find it difficult to love ourselves. And she said, yes, it was a very good project, but you did have help from your mum. And yeah, I had help from my mum. I was 8 years old. Like, what person in that class didn't? So it was like not even being able to give me the win. And also going through my primary school, I was never like the favorite kid. It was always me and somebody else. And I was always that like second person, that underdog. And that really became my narrative. And so I really learned that, oh my God, there was something wrong with that. It's a very, very deep story and deep memory, but it's to illustrate like the narratives and the labels that we take on. And I've literally this week done an Instagram post around your labels and learning how to drop those. And to be fair, it's the first podcast episode I ever did. So if you want to listen to it, I'm not going to repeat it here. Go check it out. But it's really about acknowledging the labels that other people give us and the ones that we take on, and just know that like you get a choice. You get a choice to put them down, and sometimes you've been carrying them for a really long time, and I'm okay if someone thinks I'm bossy, but I'm also a really good leader and I can own that now. But it does go back to advocating for yourself, understanding what your needs are, and turning that into a self-love practice that you can embody and you can do every single day. So I know you're like, Amira, come on, get to the steps. I need to hear them. So I'm going to take you through the steps. Couple of things I want to say first. Regardless of whether you are listening to this in real time or not, I am going to run in February a self-love challenge. So even if you listen to this months after, maybe years after, who knows? You are going to be able to click the link in the show notes and you can sign up for the challenge. And throughout this challenge, there's a real specific goal of why I want you to take part in this. It's about creating the everyday habits and practices that help you build self-love. And I think when we think about it as this big concept, it's like, where do I start? What do I do, Amira? How do I love myself more? I get what you're saying. What am I going to do now? And so being part of this challenge takes you through it. You are going to get an email a day that's going to drop into your inbox with an action, very small action, something that's not going to take more than 5 minutes of your day, because I know you're all busy. I know my community are busy achieving people. They have things to do. But the point is that if you can find that 5 minutes in that day to build that habit, every single day by the end of the challenge, you're going to have this toolbox of habits where you can say, oh, that was actually super easy, I hope. Practical, maybe a little bit confronting, but practical, and it's something that you can continue to build on. So sign up, like get involved, tag me or drop me a message. Sometimes you don't want to tag me because you don't want to shout it out to the world. I get that. But drop me a message, and on a very serious note, let me know how you get on with the challenge, the practices that you really enjoyed as well. Did it feel fun? Were there parts of it that were fun and uplifting? And anything that felt challenging, because, you know, I always want to give you the resources. I want to be able to build on that for you guys. And I want you to feel really, really supported being part of my community. Okay, so before we get into the steps to help you walk out of this episode and be like, yeah, I got something I can do. I can do this, Mirror. I can take this. I can make this practical. I want to do a bit of a reflection. You know, everything I preach about, I say, I do starts with awareness. And I know you're listening or you're watching, saying, Amira, I'm already aware. I'm not going to argue with you. You are, but I want to deepen it because it's going to help you. Now, as I said at the beginning, that self-love or the concept of it or the idea can go against what we've been taught, what we've been told about ourselves. And it can feel very self-indulgent, very self-centered. And also sometimes we have this mantra, or we've grown up with this mantra about, you know, being kind to others. And please don't think I'm saying don't be kind to others, but not at the expense of yourself. Okay, there is a difference. It's very difficult to love and show up for other people until you learn how to do that for yourself. And I'm not saying you can't learn and show up for other people. I'm never going to limit you, never going to say you have to do one before the other. Find your way of doing it. But it is important that you learn how to marry those two up. Otherwise, you're going to feel the impact of that in your relationships. So I'm going to read you. I wrote these down because otherwise I thought in the moment, I don't know if I'm going to remember them. I'm going to give you 6 reflection questions. And I want you to kind of use this as a little bit of a, I want to say the word test, but does that word scare you? Hopefully not. I want you to do it as a little bit of a check-in. Let's use that word. To see where you're at when it comes to, I guess, a little bit of a check-in or a barometer around how much you love yourself. I'm not going to ask you to score yourself out of 10, so don't worry. Okay. Question number 1. What's one thing that you've done for yourself today? Now, I was going to say it's my morning, so I'm going to share something from the previous day because this morning I had an exceptionally early start because I had prep to do and a lot of catch up. So my time is coming this evening. But yesterday, one thing I did for myself was my workout. And I know nobody's going to be surprised. Amira loves a workout, but it was at a time of day that I don't usually train. And I looked at my to-do list and I was like, I don't know how we're going to get through what needs to be ticked off for this week. But that was my space. That was my thing I did for myself. Did I enjoy it yesterday? I'm not really sure that I did, but I was so happy that I kept my word. I committed to myself. So first thing is, what's one thing you've done for yourself today? If I'm joining you on your morning commute, if you are getting the kids ready, if you are doing laundry, I only use those examples because that's what you guys send me in my DMs, okay? But if it's the morning, it's first thing and you're like, Amira, I've not done anything for myself yet. That's fine, but set the intention. What's one thing you want to be able to do for yourself today? It does not need to be huge. Sometimes, this is a fun fact, okay? Everyone thinks I'm a morning person. I'm actually not, but I do tend to get up early because it's my space and it's my time in the morning where I get to sit. Sometimes I don't even know what I do in the mornings. Yes, sometimes I gratitude, sometimes I journal, sometimes I don't. Sometimes that time in the morning just evaporates and I don't know. I might have just made my Hux greens and my matcha. That's maybe all I did, but that feeds my soul. So anyway, you got loads of examples there. Sometimes I think I tell you guys too much on the podcast and then my clients come at me and quote it in a session. I'm like, I have to strip back what I'm saying. Okay, deep question. I started with the fun one. What are the parts of you that you either feel embarrassed about or you try and hide and you don't want other people to see? I could get deep on that one, but I'm not. I'm going to leave that question there. How well do you say what you need? How many times do you, I know this is like my go-to phrase, but how many times do you say yes when on the inside you are screaming no? I think that was me for most of my 20s. I'm not going to lie, in every relationship. But we know Amira has already talked about masking and how that shows up. And I'm going to do a deeper episode on that, which is way more to do with like your inner child and healing your inner child. But that's a future ep. Okay, next question. How do you show yourself gratitude? Yes, it's Amira's go-to word, but I don't just mean being grateful for the things around you or the people around you. How are you grateful to yourself? So example, I was grateful to myself yesterday for doing my workout, despite being overloaded and despite knowing that I would usually choose work if it's super busy. And actually I honored what I needed and I'm grateful to my body for moving. It might have been a bit slower than usual, but I moved. So showing yourself that gratitude, I'll tell you why it's super important. It's a way that you learn to appreciate yourself. And when I get into the 5 steps, this will make even more sense. Okay, it's not an Amira communication podcast if I do not mention this. We all know that I speak about your negative self-talk so much. How are you speaking to yourself? I cannot tell you the amount of things my clients share with me that are negative about themselves. And we have to work on retraining that. And it's a same way you get up and you brush your teeth, the same way you go to the gym to build a muscle. Like retraining your brain and the way you speak to yourself is, I'm going to say exactly the same, but similar concept. And last but not least, I've touched on this already, how do you celebrate yourself? One of my incredible clients, I think we just finished working together after about 7 months, and we ended, I can't always guarantee this, but we ended our coaching journey on such a high. He got incredible results and some really good news in our last session. So one of his actions, kind of post-coaching, I left him with, okay, how are you going to go and celebrate yourself? And it feeds into so much of the work we did around him communicating authentically and how he wants to show up in the world and his personal brand. But that was his task. So how do you celebrate yourself? I think I've shared this on a really, really old episode. And it's funny actually, because yesterday I got really good news about a potential project that really excites me. And when I first launched the business, I used to do like a victory lap around my kitchen island. Now, bear in mind, that sounds like I live in a mansion. I don't. It's a very small kitchen island. And yesterday, for the first time in like years, I did it because it's something that super lights me up and brings me joy. And that's how I'm celebrating myself, because a lot of my previous work is why that opportunity came in. So there are 6 reflection questions. Take a pause the episode if you want to go away and reflect on them now. If not, I will also leave them in the show notes in case you didn't write them down and you're doing something else and you don't want to come back to the episode. They'll be in the show notes. Now, let's make it practical. Okay, so let's get into step number 1. No surprise. Step number 1, when you're trying to cultivate and embody self-love, is your negative self-talk. Being able to understand what it is saying, even, that makes way more sense, and how you want to reframe that dialogue so that it's kinder, it's more compassionate, it's more understanding. Now, I know, or I'm going to take a guess because I don't know, but I am going to take a guess. If I said to you, speak to yourself in a kinder way, you'd eye roll at me. And I get it, because it's an overused phrase, and you're going to be like, yes, 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 I know I need to be kind to myself. So if we make it really practical, your negative self-talk and the things that you tell yourself, the untrue truths, because you believe them to be true, but they're not, have such an impact on what you do, on whether you want to take a risk, on whether you move through the fear, on whether you decide to go for that date, on whether you settle for breadcrumbs in a relationship. So I'm not going to delve into this step loads, because if you are listening to the episodes in real time, the last solo episode, I have gone through this in a deep dive session, how to retrain your brain, how many thoughts, why our brains are wired negatively. But the good news is that you can totally change it. You can totally rewire it. May it take some work? Hell yes. So what I'm going to do in this step, 2 things is say, 1, go and listen to that episode if you are working on trying to cultivate self-love and you know that the way that you view yourself, the way that you talk to yourself is highly negative. The second thing I want to do is give you my 3 C's. I think I said these organically in that episode and I was like, oh, I like this. I'm going to use it. So 3 C's if you need to change your negative self-talk is, number 1, I want you to catch it. For a lot of us, our negative self-talk is running on autopilot. You're not even aware of what it's saying. The second thing is when you catch it, you need to challenge it. Where is your evidence that it is true? I need you to find evidence that it's not true. And thirdly, I need you to change it. I need you to reframe it. I need you to find an alternative thought for that negative thought. So if that step is helpful, if you feel like you need some more support on it, go and check out the other episode. Okay. Step number 2 is accepting yourself as you are. Now, this is what I've touched on before. And I really am feeling like super called for a separate episode on this. Please comment, let me know, drop me a message if you want this. I don't know if it's a little bit too deep, but let me get into it. So I've touched on labels already, and the labels that we give ourselves, the labels other people give us. And I think as well, an important part of this that we need to talk about is other people will give us labels because it's actually the way that our brain processes information. Like, we find it really helpful to compartmentalize, whether it's people, food, cars, whatever. That's why our brain does it. But the problem is, as people change and don't fit our labels, we then can find it really difficult to accept that somebody else has changed. And also, the reason we find it so incredibly difficult to accept is because if we have to accept that they don't fit that label, it's usually quite confronting for us because we have to accept something about ourselves that usually at that point we're not willing to accept. I told you I was going to get deep. So I want you to think about the parts of you and the labels you've collected that one, you no longer need, they're not serving you. Like, how can you let it go? And very like quick example, I would say at school, I was like, yes, you're a student. I worked my backside off, but I was also a tomboy and I was super sporty. I played football with all the boys. And I think for a lot of people, it didn't really work. They weren't able to put me into a box and it didn't really work. The two didn't match together in other people's views or their perception that they had of me. So be ready to like let go of the labels that don't work for you. So on step 2, when I'm asking you, requesting you to accept the parts of you, I want you to answer this question. What are the parts that you are trying to hide from other people or hide from the world? Because they are usually the parts that you're going to have to learn how to bring in and accept, not change, not do differently. Just accept that they're part of you. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to show up as the human that you think you need to show up as. Part of self-love is accepting who you are already. Okay, step number 3 might be my absolute favorite. It's how are you prioritizing your needs? Now, probably a question I get asked a lot, mainly from my friends. Everything you do throughout your day is essentially an act of self-love. It's either reinforcing it or it's going against it. And really good example can be when you decide to compare yourself to somebody else. That's an act that's against loving yourself, because comparing yourself to somebody else, like for like or not, is probably going to make you feel inadequate in some way. So prioritizing your needs is so important. And especially if we go back to the beginning of this episode, where we have to some extent been conditioned to, I'm generalizing here, but been conditioned to put other people before ourselves, it can feel tough, difficult when we then want to prioritize what we need. So think about how many times you've fallen into the trap of doing something because you think you should do it or because you feel guilty. I cannot tell you how many times that word comes up, or how many people will say to me, yeah, but Mira, I feel bad. Okay, you do, but are you prioritizing your needs? And it's a separate thing around learning how to sit with that guilt and sit with that uncomfortableness. So when it comes to your priorities, I like saying, we do this. If you are part of my IG community, we do this every single week. I say, what's your non-negotiable or your priority, whatever you want to call it, for the week? And I love for you to share just one, because we do kind of fall into the trap of, I've got to have 10 priorities this week. Okay, well, do you have mental capacity for that? And some weeks you might, and some weeks you might not. So honor that. And once you've written your priority down, how are you keeping to that? How are you following through with that? And I'm not saying you can't be flexible, but I would say for most of us within this community, we aren't prioritizing our needs and what's important to us enough. So think about that as you're moving through your week. Think about the night before, taking 5 minutes before bed to think about what's one thing you want to prioritize for tomorrow that's important for you. Okay, step number 4. Communicating your boundaries. I think there are so many episodes in this podcast as a whole around boundaries. So I'm a really big advocate of supporting you guys to create them, communicate them, and uphold them. And the reason why it's a really important piece of self-love is it's the way that you look after yourself, as I've said already, but it's also the way that you show other people that you want to be treated. It's like setting the benchmark for what you're willing to accept and what you're not. And I know that like conversations around boundaries and having to say something awkwardly can really fill some people with dread, or some people just don't know how to say it in what they say is like the right way. And they don't want the conversation to get lost, or they want their message to land. So I always say, as well as your boundaries looking after yourself, it sets that tone for the relationship, whether it's professional, whether it's personal, whatever it is. And if you don't learn really how to lean into this, and it's a journey, it doesn't have to be a an overnight solution, and there's different elements of boundaries. You might be really good at knowing what your boundaries are, but you might be less good at actually communicating them. Or maybe you can do it really well at work because it's professional, but when it's at home in your personal life, you really struggle. But I do say that boundaries remove that expectation of expecting somebody else to read your mind. Nobody can read your mind. So please sit back and pause and understand, like, what is it that you need and how you're communicating that and sharing that with somebody else. Okay, we made it, guys. The last and final step is learning how to forgive yourself, aka self-compassion. Now, this has to be part of my 5 steps to cultivating self-love, especially for you who's an overachiever, okay? You listening, watching, I know. And I think when we fall into constantly striving, constantly trying to reach our next goal, constantly doing, we are so good. I'm going to put myself in this bracket, or previous me, because I've got much better at this. We are so good at judging ourselves. We are so good at berating ourselves. We are so good at criticizing. None of that supports this notion of self-love. This doesn't mean we are trying to be perfect. This doesn't mean that we are showing up in the world saying we're never going to make a mistake. But when we do, it's about asking yourself to have compassion for that mistake, for the thing that you didn't say when you should have said it, for not upholding your boundary, for going back on it when you told your family you can't help or attend that event. Having that compassion for yourself. And I say this a lot to my clients. When you're trying to change the way you communicate or the way you show up in your relationships or your habits or your behavior, it can take time because you're trying to relearn something that you've probably learned a long, long time ago and it's probably quite ingrained. So learning how to forgive yourself and create compassionate dialogue is incredibly important. And this is really where a lot of the things that we carry shame around, the things we feel embarrassed about, we can find difficult to forgive ourselves for. Now, that's where I might do a bit of a deeper episode because it's really about your inner work, nourishing your inner child. But one thing I do want to say is that if you carry that shame or that embarrassment about something that's happened to you or something you've done, until you voice it and can own it, it's probably going to control you and consume you. So as part of this step, I want you to write out and say to yourself, you can pause the episode, you can do this afterwards, and say, I forgive myself for, and insert whatever it is. That's going to be a practical thing I want you to do for this step. Okay, beautiful people. I don't know who I think I am because I know that I ran this episode as an extremely long solo episode, but a topic that I've kind of touched on before. There are episodes on the podcast already around it, but I wanted to do it from a really different angle. And I know before I've done it through a really self-compassionate lens and creating that inner dialogue. So I hope that you are walking away today with a better understanding of why you need it, the impact if you don't learn how to cultivate that self-love, and some tools that make you feel like, yeah, I can do that, Amira. I can work on it. Okay, I'm not going to say you're going to wake up tomorrow and you're going to fully love yourself, but it is a journey and it's a practice. And remember, if this is something that you're working on this year or any year, sign up to the challenge and you're going to get habits and practices that you can embody even. That's the word I'm looking for. So wherever you are today, wherever you have joined from, I want to say thank you for having me in your ears or on your TV. Guys, thanks for joining us for another conversation this week. You know the deal by now, so please hit subscribe, leave a review. Don't forget to share this with a friend. And if you want to come and hang out with me, then click Instagram. You'll find me at _communication expert.